Mara's hands didn't shake anymore. She'd noticed that somewhere around day 412, when she'd been splinting her own broken finger against a strip of aluminum torn from a collapsed storage shelf, and had realized, almost distantly, that her hands were perfectly still. Not brave, not numb, just steady, like they'd made a private decision her mind hadn't been consulted about. The Vorkai had not expected that. They hadn't expected a lot of things about humans, she'd come to understand. But the hands were the part that confused them most. She knew because the one she'd started calling Watcher had told her so, in that low, resonant clicking language it used when it forgot to translate, and then caught itself, and said it again in something approximating English. You should be shaking. That is what fear does to biological systems. She'd looked at it, this thing that was 9 feet of angular gray geometry, and compound eyes like shattered mirrors, and she'd said, I know. I used to shake all the time. That had been Watcher's question, 4 months ago, on one of its earlier visits. It still came back. She supposed that meant something. It had started, as endings usually do, without adequate warning. The Vorkai did not issue ultimatums. They did not make speeches or broadcast demands across hijacked frequencies. They arrived the way a pressure system arrives, invisibly, inevitably, and then all at once. One morning the sky over every populated continent on Earth simply changed color. Not dramatically, just wrong. A kind of bruised amber at the edges where blue should have been, and a silence that pressed down on the world like a held breath. By noon of that first day, 7 of Earth's 9 largest cities had stopped transmitting. Mara had been in none of them. She had been in Wick, Scotland, population 4,000, assistant manager of a hardware store that smelled of sawdust and WD-40, eating a cheese sandwich over a crossword puzzle she would never finish. She remembered thinking the amber light through the window was pretty, in a troubling sort of way. That sandwich was the last ordinary thing she ate for a long time. Her brother Callum had called her 11 minutes before the comms grid collapsed. He was in Edinburgh. She had heard his voice clearly, the way you hear something you know you're going to replay for the rest of your life. Mara, listen. Whatever you do, don't go south. Don't go toward the cities. Just stay. The line had gone dead with a sound like a door closing softly. She stayed. She listened. She did not go south. She was not a soldier. She had no training, no stockpile, no plan. What she had was a hardware store full of supplies, a town too small to be worth a Vorkai's immediate attention, and a brain that, under sufficient pressure, turned out to be irritatingly practical. She had always been like that. Callum used to say it was her least romantic quality. When everyone else is crying, he'd told her once, you're already looking for a bucket. She found buckets. She found a great many things. The Vorkai were thorough. She would give them that. They did not hate humans. That was the first thing she had to understand, and it took her a long time to accept it because hatred would have been easier to navigate. Hatred had a shape. Hatred made mistakes driven by emotion. The Vorkai did not hate. They simply calculated. They were the galaxy's oldest functioning civilization, 200,000 years of unbroken continuity, and in all that time they had encountered 43 species that had achieved spaceflight or its functional equivalent. Of those 43, 31 had eventually posed what Vorkai's strategic doctrine classified as a cascade risk, a species whose rate of technological and territorial expansion, left unchecked, would destabilize established galactic order within a predictable window. Humanity had posted the fastest cascade risk timeline in recorded history, not because humans were uniquely violent, though the Vorkai found human violence notable in its creativity, not because human technology was advanced, because it wasn't, not by any meaningful comparison, but because of the rate, the acceleration, the sheer incomprehensible speed at which humans moved from stone tools to splitting atoms, from caves to launching themselves at the moon, from isolation to global interconnection. The Vorkai ran the models 900 times, using 17 different projection systems, and every single model returned the same answer. Left alone, humanity would be everywhere within 3,000 years. 3,000 years was, by Vorkai reckoning, approximately next week. The decision was not cruel. It was, from their perspective, simply correct. A controlled reduction. Population brought below the cascade threshold. Approximately 40,000 individuals, scattered, pre-industrial, sufficient for genetic continuity, but stripped of the organizational complexity that made the species dangerous. It had been done before. It would be done again. The subject species always survived. They simply survived smaller. The Vorkai were very good at this. What they were not good at, it turned out, was Mara. Day 1 through 30, survival. She did not think of it in those terms at the time. She thought of it as simply getting through the next hour, and then the next one. The Vorkai did not come to Wick immediately. Small settlements were low priority. That gave her time, and she used time the way she used everything else. Without elegance, with great stubbornness, until it bent to her purpose. She found 10 other survivors in the first week. A retired nurse named Bia, 73 years old and furious about it. 2 brothers, teenagers, who had been camping when the event happened and had walked 40 miles back to find their family gone. A Coast Guard officer, a woman named Priya, who had been a structural engineer, and who turned out to be the most valuable person Mara had ever met. 5 others of varying backgrounds, varying states of shock, varying usefulness. She did not have time for the ones who couldn't function. That sounds colder than it was. She did not abandon them. She found them tasks they could manage. She gave the most shattered ones the jobs that required the least thinking and the most repetition. Filling water containers, sorting tins, keeping watch from the church tower, because repetition was a kind of anchor, and anchor was what they needed. B handled the ones who wept, which turned out to be most of them at some point, because B had the particular gift of being a hard woman who was also warm, and that combination was more useful than anything Mara could have stockpiled. Mara herself did not weep until day 16. She did it alone, in the back room of the hardware store, at 2 in the morning, for approximately 4 minutes. Then she washed her face with water from a salvaged bottle, went back to her notes, and started working out how to insulate the church hall for winter. She thought of Callum while she worked. She let herself think of him for exactly as long as it took her to finish the insulation schematic. Then she put him somewhere quiet and internal, behind the part of her brain that was keeping everyone alive. And she promised herself she would take him out again when she could afford to. She had not yet found the time. Day 47. First contact. She saw the Vorkai scout 300 meters out, moving across the headland with that particular gait they had. Angular and deliberate, like a piece of industrial architecture that had decided to take a walk. It was scanning. She could tell because the air around it shimmered slightly when it turned. A side effect of its sensor array that she had read about in the fragmentary information she'd pieced together from the town's last downloaded internet cache. She had 2 options: hide or do something inadvisable. She stepped out into the open. B, watching from the church tower, later reported that she had said several words at that moment that she would not repeat in company. The Vorkai scout stopped, its sensor array oriented on Mara. She stood with her hands at her sides, which took some doing, because her heart was doing something complicated and loud inside her chest, and every nerve in her body was making a compelling case for running. She did not run. She raised one hand in a gesture that she was aware was probably meaningless to an alien intelligence, but which was the only thing she had. She kept her eyes on it. She had learned from the cache data that the Vorkai perceived sustained visual engagement as a signal of cognitive processing, essentially that you were thinking, rather than simply reacting. She had no idea if that applied to human eyes. She was making a bet with her life as the stake. The scout regarded her for 11 seconds. She counted. Then it turned and walked away. She went back inside and sat down on the floor of the hardware store and breathed until her heart made sense again. Then she started working out what the next encounter might look like and how to survive it. She made notes. She always made notes. The notes became something between a field guide and a diary, written in 3 notebooks salvaged from the local post office, in handwriting that got smaller and more compressed as the weeks passed and the pages became precious. They contained everything: Vorkai movement patterns observed from the church tower, mapped onto hand-drawn grids, behavioral anomalies, the discovery that the scouts operated on 4-hour rotational cycles, and the 30-minute gap in coverage that opened on the western approach when the rotation changed, structural weaknesses in the 2 buildings they'd reinforced, caloric calculations for the group's food stores, notes on who was struggling and how, observations about morale, about tension, about the particular social dynamics of 12 people under existential pressure in a small space. Priya had found the notes once, while Mara slept, and read them cover to cover. When Mara woke up, she said, very quietly, "You know this is extraordinary. It's just notes," Mara said. Priya had given her a look. "No, it isn't." They had not discussed it further. There wasn't time. There was never time. Day 119. The ambush that wasn't. The Vorkai sent a retrieval unit to Wick. Standard protocol she would later understand. Small settlements were revisited on a rolling schedule, assessed, and if population was above threshold, processed. The retrieval unit was 4 soldiers and a processor drone. They were efficient. They had done this thousands of times. What they had not done was approach a settlement where someone had spent 70 days studying their patrol patterns. Mara had not planned a fight. She was not stupid. 13 people with salvaged tools against 4 alien soldiers with weapons she couldn't categorize was not a fight. It was an obituary. What she had planned was invisible. By the time the retrieval unit reached the center of town, it found 11 scattered signs of recent habitation. Cold fire pits, a few stored food containers, 2 cots, and no people. The processor drone conducted 3 sweeps and returned a finding of prior occupation, current absence, probable migration. The retrieval unit logged the settlement as cleared and moved on. The group was in the storm drainage system beneath the town. They had been there for 4 hours in the dark and the cold and the smell. The 2 teenage brothers had not made a sound. B, 73 years old, had not made a sound. Diane had arrived on day 63 from the coast road, half-starved and entirely silent, and in the 8 weeks since had not spoken more than 30 words. But she had held the youngest member of the group, a 9-year-old boy they'd found alone on day 22, and kept him calm and silent for the entire 4 hours without being asked. When they came up out of the drainage grate into the gray northern light, Mara had looked at these 12 people, the brothers still holding each other's arms, B brushing grit from her coat with the focused calm of someone tidying a kitchen, Diane still holding the boy, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder, and felt something move through her that she did not have language for. She added a note to Notebook 2. Day 208. Watcher. The Vorkai that found her a second time was different from the Scout. She knew it immediately, and not just because of its markings, which were more complex, more decorative in ways she was learning to read as indicators of rank. She knew it because it didn't scan her and leave. It stopped, and it looked at her, and it did something she had not yet seen a Vorkai do. It waited. She was alone. She had been alone deliberately. She took solo perimeter walks at dawn, partly for practical reasons, and partly because she had discovered that an hour without anyone needing anything from her was necessary for her continued functional sanity. She had her longest knife on her belt and a flare gun she'd maintained out of pure mechanical habit, despite knowing it would accomplish nothing. She looked at the Vorkai. It looked at her. She said out loud, to an alien intelligence that almost certainly didn't understand a word, "You're not here to report me, are you?" The Vorkai made a sound like tectonic plates considering a disagreement. Then, in English that was recognizable, but had a texture like stone grinding on stone, it said, "No." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why not?" And it said, "You were here before. You are still here. That is not typical." She nodded slowly. She thought of Callum. She thought of the drainage tunnel. She thought of B's handwriting on the watch schedule. Meticulous and unintimidating and utterly reliable. She said, "We're stubborn." Watcher, she had not yet started calling it that, regarded her with eyes like broken mirrors. It said, "We have no word for it. What you are. We have encountered it before, but only individually. One survivor who would not stop. We have a word for that. It means the error that persists. But you are not one. You are." It paused, and the pause had weight. "You are organized." She said, "Is that why you're here? To look at us?" It said, "Yes." She said, "And what have you decided?" It said nothing for a long time, long enough that the light changed slightly, and a bird called somewhere across the headland, and she became aware of the cold in a way she hadn't been. Then it said, "I have decided to come back." She watched it leave. Then she went back to the group and made notes. Day 360. The question. Watcher came back 14 times, always to find Mara, always alone, always to talk. She learned things. Some of them were terrifying. Some of them were useful, and she was learning to categorize information almost entirely by usefulness, which she suspected was doing something to her that she'd need to examine later, in the hypothetical future where later existed. She learned the scope of what had happened. She learned that Earth's surviving population was in the low 100,000s, scattered, mostly unorganized. She learned that the Vorkai intended to allow those survivors to persist. The protocol had never been about extinction, just reduction, and that within 2 generations, without organizational infrastructure, the cascade risk timeline would be sufficiently extended. She learned that Watcher was a designation she'd invented that was not entirely inaccurate. The Vorkai term for its role translated approximately as the one who records anomalies. She was the anomaly. Her group was the anomaly. On day 360, Watcher asked her something. It said, "Why?" She said, "Why what?" It said, "Why persist? You understand the calculation. You understand that numerical survival is guaranteed. Your continuation as individuals is not required for species continuation. The effort you exert is not rational given the return." She was quiet for a while. Around her, the headland was brown and winter-bleached, and the sea made its indifferent noise. And somewhere behind her, Priya was working on a new structural reinforcement, and the sound of hammering came faintly through the cold. She said, "You're asking why we don't just stop?" Watcher said, "Yes." She thought about Callum, about Bee's handwriting, about Diane holding a small boy in the dark for 4 hours without being asked, about her own hands, steady around a broken finger, steadier every day, steady in ways she hadn't asked for. She said, "I don't know how to explain it to something that does math about this." Watcher said, "Try." She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "We don't stop. That's not what we are. That's never been what we are. You ran your models and your timelines and your cascade projections, and they were probably all accurate, and it doesn't matter, because you forgot to put one variable in. You forgot to account for the fact that when you push us, we don't calculate whether it's rational to keep going. We just keep going. We do it for each other. We do it because someone else needs us to. We do it because stopping isn't the kind of thing that occurs to us as an option even when it should. And that's..." She paused, and something moved through her that she still didn't have language for. "That's not the scary part. The scary part is that we're going to teach that to everyone we find." Watcher was silent. She said, "How many survivors have you logged that are organized?" Watcher said, 3 groups. Yours is the largest." She said, "Not for long." She went back to her notes. Day 412. The finger. It snapped during a salvage run when a piece of collapsed shelving came down wrong. The sound was small and specific, and she had barely registered it before her body informed her, with some urgency, of what had happened. She sat down on the rubble, held her hand up, assessed the damage with the particular calm that had replaced panic somewhere in the last year, and then stripped a piece of aluminum from the shelving and used her belt to bind it and her own teeth to tighten the binding. Her hands were perfectly still. She noticed. She moved on. She had 3 sites to check, and 4 hours of light left. Day 503. The network. Priya had rebuilt the radio. Not from components they'd started with, those were long gone, but from components she'd accumulated over more than a year of knowing, always, what to keep and what to trade for something better. The antenna was a sculpture of salvaged metal that looked like nothing and worked like a miracle. The range was sufficient. That was all they needed. Mara sat with the handset for a long time before she used it. Then she broadcast on 6 frequencies, in rotation, for 4 hours. A simple message in English, and then in the 3 most widely spoken other languages she could manage, which was not many, but was more than 0. She said, "We are in the north of Scotland. We are 13 people. We have shelter, food stores, medical supplies, and a structural engineer. If you can hear this, you are not alone." She said it every hour for 4 hours. On the 3rd day of broadcasting, someone answered. They were in Norway. They were 22 people. They had been organized for 8 months. Their leader was a woman named Sigrid, who communicated in careful, precise English, and who, when Mara explained what she had been doing for 500 days, was quiet for a moment, and then said, in a tone Mara recognized because she heard it in her own voice, "We have been doing something similar." Mara said, "Are you keeping notes?" Sigrid said, "Yes." Mara said, "Good." They talked for 3 hours. Mara filled notebook 4, day 617. Watcher's final visit. It came at dawn, which was unusual. It stood at the edge of the settlement and waited for her, which was by now its established pattern, and she walked out to it with her coffee. She had found coffee, which had felt like a divine intervention, and she stood with it in the new light and waited for it to speak. It said, "The council has been informed of our reports," she said, and, it said, "There is disagreement." She said, "About us." It said, "About the variable you named, the one we did not account for." She looked at it. She said, "What do you need from me?" It said, "Nothing. I have come to tell you something. The reduction protocol has been suspended pending review. This is..." It paused, and the pause had the quality of something enormous turning. "This has not occurred before." She held her coffee. The steam rose in the cold. Somewhere behind her, Bee was already moving, already doing the first things of the day, steady and unstoppable, and 74 years old now. She said, "What tipped it?" Watcher said, "Your networks. In 600 days you have established contact with 11 organized groups across 4 landmasses. Total affiliated population, 4,312 individuals. Growth rate." It paused again, and she thought she heard something in the pause, something that might have been awe in a thing that perhaps didn't have a word for awe. "Growth rate is consistent with early-stage civilization." She said, "It's not a civilization. It's just people helping people." Watcher said, "Yes, that is what civilizations are." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What happens now?" Watcher said, "The council debates. That will take time. My kind debates slowly, but debate means the question is open. And open questions..." Another pause. Open questions do not stay open in your favor unless you continue. She said, "We'll continue." It said, "I know." It looked at her with those mirror-shard eyes, and she looked back, and she thought of the first day she had stepped out into the open. No plan, no training, just the absolute refusal to hide. She thought of everything between then and now. She thought of Callum, in his quiet internal place, and promised him again that she would take him out when she could afford to. She still couldn't afford to. She suspected she was all right with that. Watcher turned and walked away across the headland. She watched it go. Then she went inside and updated the network contact schedule, and added 3 items to the construction priority list, and reminded herself to ask Priya about the Western Shelter expansion. She did not think about the council, or the debate, or the suspended protocol. Those were things that would happen or not happen, and she would respond when they did. In the meantime, there was today. There were 4,312 people who were alive in part because someone had decided, without fanfare, that they were not finished. She picked up Notebook 5. She made notes. Across the galaxy, in chambers that had not changed in 40,000 years, the Vorkai Council reviewed the suspended protocol for the first time in their recorded history. It had never been suspended before. Not once. In 200,000 years of stewardship and reduction and careful galactic maintenance, no subject species had ever generated sufficient anomalous data to warrant a pause. The protocol was not a weapon. It was not even a policy. It was a mathematical instrument, as reliable as gravity, as morally neutral as a tide. The lead analyst presented the case for reinstatement. Population figures were within acceptable deviation, it said. Reduction had functioned as intended. Cascade risk timeline had been extended by the projected margin. Reinstatement was procedurally correct. The chamber considered this. Then Watcher spoke. It was not customary for a field observer to address the council directly. It was not prohibited either, because no one had thought to prohibit it. Watcher said, "I have a question for the reinstatement case." The analyst waited. Watcher said, "The protocol targets organizational complexity. This is its mechanism. Remove the infrastructure. Remove the accumulated knowledge. Remove the ability to coordinate at scale. The individual biology persists. The dangerous capacity does not. This is the theory." The analyst said, "That is correct." Watcher said, "Then I would ask the analyst to review Field Reports Series 7 through 441, specifically the subsection filed under Behaviors Not Captured by Existing Models." The analyst reviewed. The chamber waited. The analyst set down the report. It said, slowly, as something large and structural shifted in its thinking. She was rebuilding it. Watcher said, "Yes." It said, "One individual, no prior training, no surviving institutional framework." She was reconstructing organizational complexity from first principles, using 10 others and 3 notebooks, while under active suppression. Watcher said, 11 at the end of the first week, 13 after day 22, when she found the child, and a straggler arrived on day 63, 4,312, at last contact. The protocol was running. She was building faster than it reduced. The chamber was very quiet for a long time. The analyst said, "This is not a feature of the subject species that our models include." Watcher said, "No, we modeled what they had built. We did not model what they do when it is taken from them. We did not ask what happens when you remove everything from a species that treats rebuilding as an involuntary reflex." It let that sit. Then it said, "I have spent 600 days observing one human in one small settlement on a peripheral world. In that time she has reconstituted communication networks, medical infrastructure, agricultural planning, defensive strategy, intercommunity diplomacy, and written records of everything she has learned about us. She did not do this because she was ordered to. She did not do this because she calculated it was rational. She did it because there were people who needed it done, and she was there, and so she did it, and she did not stop." The chamber waited. Watcher said, "Our error was not the reduction. Our error was believing that what we reduced was the source of the risk. The infrastructure, the cities, the technology, those are not what makes this species what it is. They are what this species makes. Inevitably, repeatedly, given any surface to work on and any reason to continue. The cascade risk is not a product of their civilization. It is a product of what they are without one." The chamber was the quietest it had been in 40,000 years. The analyst said, "Then the protocol cannot achieve its stated objective." Watcher said, "No, it cannot." A long pause. The analyst said, "What do you recommend?" Watcher said, "Contact, formal and structured. We explain what we feared and why. We negotiate terms. We find out whether a species that rebuilds this stubbornly is something we can work with, or whether we have been asking the wrong question from the beginning." It paused one final time. It said, In 600 days of observation, I have found one thing I did not expect to find. Not a threat, not an anomaly, a peer. I recommend we introduce ourselves properly. In the north of Scotland, Mara was already on the radio. She did not know about the council, or the debate, or what had just shifted in a chamber 40,000 light-years away. She knew there was a group in Iceland who had gone silent for 3 days, and she was trying to raise them. She knew the Western Shelter needed another support beam before the next storm. She knew Bay had taught the boy to read from salvaged paperbacks, and that he was better at it than anyone had expected. She knew that Sigrid, in Norway, had made contact with 2 more groups, that the network was now 15 nodes, that Notebook 5 was nearly full. She made notes. The notes would keep coming. That was simply what she did, what she had always done, what she would keep doing. And she had already located a 6th notebook in a locked storeroom 2 streets over, and had already noted 3 more locations worth checking. She always would.